the companies winning with AI aren't the ones with the biggest budgets. They're the ones who are starting right now. If you've been waiting for someone to cut through the noise and show you exactly how AI could transform your work, your wait is over. Your competitors have already signed up. I'm Kenny, founder of Brim and the host of the AI Opportunity.
Welcome to the AI Opportunity. This week, I'm with Patrick Sullivan. Super excited to have you on the show, Patrick. Really, really nice to have you here. So welcome.
Kenny, thank you. Honestly, I'm honored to be here. Grateful that you're providing this platform for your listeners.
No, awesome. So for the listeners, Patrick, I think is going to be a very interesting guest for us. So not only has Patrick got a 25-year experience when it comes to IT security and broadly compliance, but he also has a PhD in artificial intelligence, and he is a member of a lot of accreditation boards around essentially how do you do the right things by your business? How do you keep the business safe? How do you keep your data safe? Given what's happening with AI and more AI is being given access to tools and information across companies, we really thought that Patrick would be a really great guest for those executives and leaders and team members who are thinking about AI and how to deploy it safely. So Patrick, let's get into it. Maybe you can tell us a bit about you.
Well, one point of clarification, I'm all but dissertation on my PhD. So
Okay.
I cannot say that I currently hold
No worries. You're nearly there. That's the most important thing.
the hardest part, actually getting the dissertation produced.
Exactly.
And yeah, a little bit about me. I mean, Kenny, you nailed it. I've been in field for almost 30 years at this point, which is kind of unbelievable to hear myself say. I started out in general IT, then IT managed services, then cybersecurity, transitioned to compliance, and now, through grace, serendipity, if you will, I've landed in the emerging field of AI governance. We're at a really interesting inflection point in that we finally have regulation causing business leaders to think about what legitimate strategies and next steps are, converging with market pressure, wherein the market is demanding that business leaders understand and make plain what their next steps are. So it's a really, really exciting time. It can be a scary time, to be perfectly plain. I think cautious optimism is probably the best way to think about where our leaders should have their heads today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the promise of AI is super exciting. But as you say, that there is caution that has to be applied.
Necessarily, yes.
So I thought it was really interesting what you said about sort of regulation starting to shape the landscape. I mean, our audience are not necessarily going to be experienced lawyers or know all the different regulation that is shaping the landscape around AI. Maybe you could talk to us about some of the sort of new rules that people should be really conscious of. That would be really helpful.
And I think the elephant in the room as it relates to AI regulation is the EU AI Act. So the EU AI Act, in its various iterations and various forms, is regulation that's intended to ensure effectively product safety over the deployment of AI tools and the product of AI tools. And so in many ways, when you think about this as someone who's used a toaster before, you want to ensure that as you plug that toaster in, as you put bread in the toaster and use the toaster to toast your bread, that at no point are you electrocuted, that the bread shoots out and burns your house down. I mean, there are so many considerations as it relates to ensuring that that product is safe for use by the general public. What we see in the AI Act is regulation intended to do similar things with AI and AI-related tools. Now, that said, this has really become a fundamental change in thinking for many business leaders, because what we have now is not a recommendation, not guidance. What we have is a legal obligation to ensure certain controls, certain mechanisms, and certain strategies are in place if you do intend to deploy AI or the product of AI systems into the European market. So it's a total game changer, Kenny.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously you framed it as being the European market because it's an EU regulation. But I think one of the things we've seen historically has been when the European Union establishes regulation, it often has a ripple effect across the world, right? If you look at, say,
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
so GDPR and what that has now done in California and likely to do across the US in the coming years, and we've seen similar rules across Australia and
Yeah.
in Asia, and so you would assume as the market matures more, actually many of the frameworks that have been established around sort of AI and the EU's rules are probably going to become globally orientated. Is that fair to say?
And I think not only is it fair to say, but I think for many it's a foregone conclusion. And really, the hallmark of the EUAI Act, again, is product safety. So let's protect the humans that are either using or affected by outcomes of these systems. It's really hard to argue that that's not a good idea. Where we do see the arguments and where we do see opposition pushback, calls for change, or around implementation, we all recognize that protecting humans or supporting human flourishing is a good idea, but because of various cultures, various drives, various motives, we don't all necessarily recognize that getting there in a similar way is the right thing to do,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean it's a world of multiple sort of mindsets, I guess. I mean, it's really interesting what you say though about protecting humans. I think for a lot of people, just that phrase alone will feel extremely contentious. But yeah, maybe you can unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by protecting humans?
Right. Well, what we see in the use of tools is not necessarily that the algorithms themselves are bad, but what we do see is that force feeding information from the past, that is previous outcomes and the training data we have through algorithms, necessarily creates similar biased outcomes to the biased outcomes we've had in the past. And so we create a position wherein potentially material harms that can befall humans because of these systems. But prime example, hiring systems. We see many HR systems that will force filter resumes, force filter screening so that people of a certain geographic region, people of a certain age, people of a certain, you name it, whatever the cohort may be, are necessarily filtered out of the hiring process. There is no way to argue that that does not produce biased and disparate outcomes. And so what we have to ensure is that where we do have these blind spots based on the data, that we have mechanisms to identify and then correct those blind spots so that the harms that befall the community are minimized. And Kenny, today we just don't have those mechanisms in place globally. So we're really working as quickly as we can to ensure that we do identify as many of the blind spots as we can and shore them up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think it's actually a very topical thing in Britain in particular, and I would say in a lot of sort of Western Hemisphere and probably even Asian countries as well, where I think for a lot of executives and listeners to this particular show, the idea of AI regulation probably feels quite abstract because their lives are not touched by,
Nebulous.
or at least they perceive that their lives are not touched by AI regulation. But I guess there are areas where it actually does manifest itself and it's the driver. So, I mean, a couple of examples that we've seen for companies that we work with are, for example, insurance premiums, right? More and more, we're going to see insurers really ask the question of what do you do with AI and how do you manage the risks, right?
Right.
And then from a personal perspective, especially in highly surveilled societies where there are cameras everywhere, increasingly we're starting to see kind of the government and law enforcement use AI as a way of essentially policing you without policing you, without you knowing, right? So are there good examples of where you feel like harm can really befall people? I know it's a bit of negative conversation, but it'd be really good to anchor this in people's minds so they understand that, this isn't regulation for the sake of regulation. This is something that can really have an impact on lives, right?
Kenny, and there are so many examples. You mentioned surveillance and biometric surveillance in particular, using facial recognition to identify without a direct need outside the law enforcement context, prohibited. That just is not something that the global community is prepared to accept. But other areas wherein we see biased outcomes producing harm, healthcare, there are documented instances of people of color being rejected certain treatments only because historical data showed something. Maybe this wasn't as efficacious as another treatment was. Maybe it was too costly, but whatever the case may be. So healthcare is a huge example. Credit scoring, housing, the financial industry, as we think about actually offering loans. There are so many instances where direct and material harm can befall individual humans, individual stakeholders, simply because the data being used and run through the algorithms created an output that said that perhaps this person wasn't worth taking a risk on, or perhaps this person was too high a risk for us to offer our services to. So innumerable examples of disparate outcomes causing material harm.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because as someone who's technical, I listen to what you're saying and think about how that bias can be baked in. But I
Yes.
think for a lot of people who perhaps are interfacing with AI for the first time or are not familiar with how algorithms are built, it's easy to trust AI as if it's correct and it's always correct. And the
Right.
background of labeling information, fitting information so that you can have a specific outcome or you can model data in a certain way, that's fundamentally a human task, right? A
Yes.
human has decided this is where I want to draw the line.
Yes.
This group, I'm going to classify them like this. This
This
group,
word.
I'm going to classify them like that. And using it can sometimes feel a real abstraction from the fact that actually bias is easily linked because someone had to build that at some point. Well, what are your thoughts on that? Because, like I said, I think it's hard at times for people to really connect with that, you know?
Yeah, and again, I don't think, to your point, these decisions regarding features, regarding how a data is evaluated, those are all human decisions. So absolutely, humans are part of this process, and it's long been said that AI is a socio-technical system. You know, we've got all the technology, but then we've got the human interaction and the human decisions that feed into that to produce our outcomes. So, Kenny, you're exactly right, but what I think we take for granted is that systems do have emergent properties. And so I don't necessarily believe that, well, there are clearly bad actors in the world, but I don't necessarily believe that the majority of biased outcomes that we see are because of malintent from the developers. What I think those are emergent properties that come from the system itself, things that we would not necessarily have seen through the windshield, but that we see through the rearview mirror very, very clearly. You know, Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called Black Swan, where when he identified all these major events that happened in history and how clearly we saw them in retrospect, but we never saw them coming as we were approaching those moments of boom. And I think we're very much living in a black swan era today as it relates to the outcomes that we're receiving from these AI systems.
That's really interesting. I mean, just again, to make this as relatable as possible,
Oh, please.
would you like breaking down, would you mind breaking down what do you mean by emergent properties? Because I think that's a really important concept to understand how AI can evolve, you know?
Sure. So, what's the best way to put this? Maybe in the context of the alignment problem. You know, I think many in this space are familiar with the concept of the alignment problem.
We're not. Please break it down.
So, the alignment problem is essentially in training systems, and those systems that we are using reinforcement training, we set a goal. Perhaps I create an agent, and a big example is um, a particular video game. Those of you that follow up on this, there's actually a book written on this called The Alignment Problem. It's incredible. It lays out different mental biases that we carry and ways that we can begin addressing them. But in this particular example, programmers had created an agent to exist in this video game. And I think the game itself was a boat driving through the water that was intended to drive over coins that were floating in the air. And so essentially the goal given to the agent in the video game was to maximize point total. Well, this agent had found that through the video game, it didn't necessarily have to proceed linearly through the game, level by level. It found that it could maximize point total simply by driving in circles and hitting the coins that reappeared as it was driving in circles. And so what we had was a behavior of the system, an emergent property, a property that we had never intended to be there, but emerged through operation, wherein the agent chose a behavior that made sense for the goal in hand, but was completely misaligned with the intent that the programmers gave it. You know, as a programmer, my thought is maximize point total and the unspoken, the unstated boundary of as you progress through the game one level at a time. As we create these systems, Kenny, and we aren't explicit with our expectations every step along the way, where we don't lay out clear guardrails for expectations and kill points, we position ourselves to have tools whose emergent properties create behaviors and outcomes that we never could have foreseen. Just new things that were not part of our worldview before the system went into production.
Yeah, I guess to kind of base that in a lot of people's kind of general knowledge, for those who are sort of watchers of films, and if you've ever watched The Terminator, I mean, that's the ultimate alignment problem, right? So Terminator, the whole idea is that the Terminators were built to serve humans, and then they efficiently understood that the best way to protect humans was to get rid of humans, right? Because they can't damage the world if they don't exist. Exactly. And so that's a really, really interesting point around emergent properties, because in some respects, it's easy to believe that AI is essentially just prompts, right? Right now, you chat with a chat bot, it gives you a response. And I think at times it's hard for people to realize that actually, when we talk about AI is everywhere already, right? It's how
Yeah.
your plane is landed. It's how you're being surveilled when you walk down the street. It's how banks are deciding whether they want to give you an overdraft or a loan.
The price that you paid for that plane ticket that you landed on.
Exactly. Or yeah, I mean, talking about prices, and the economic impact is massive, right? Like, you could go to Amazon right now and want to buy an item, and then, I could go to Amazon and want to buy an item, and we'd have totally different prices, right? Because AI is working out what's our propensity to spend money,
Right.
who's going to pay more. And so, yeah, I think at times these sort of emergent properties, the power of models is quite abstract, but what you've talked about, and I think this leads to my next question, which is that these challenges and the regulation around it is so important, at least that's my view, and I'm sure it's your view too,
Okay. Totally agree.
because of the really negative social impact it can have. Now, I don't think we spoke about this before, but I'm sure you have close people to you in your life, right? And so, how do you feel that people like us who are in the AI world, and the listeners who are going to be implementing AI or looking at implementing AI in their companies, how do you think we should be carrying that responsibility? Like, how should we be thinking about the consequences of these tools that we're adopting, the new algorithms that we want to accelerate our businesses? Because
Mhm.
it's a forward-looking and a rear view mirror problem, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. And I think, and Kenny, this will be very abstract, but I think we have to continue to think about our deployment of these tools and any other emergent technologies from a human perspective. One of the hallmarks of the AI Act, EU Act, and one of the hallmarks of really the only international standard around responsible development use of AI today, ISO 42001, is this need to fully understand impacts. That is, harms that could befall users, stakeholders of this particular system. And so I think leading with how will this impact the humans that use the system always has to be a part of the conversation. It just does. I think when we remove humans from this link, we completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's great that we can automate inferences and decisions at scale, but if we aren't automating those inferences and decisions at scale to benefit humanity, then we're harming humanity. There really is no middle ground here. And so I think that has to be part of the ethos for all leaders as you are making the decision to deploy AI. I think for you, the first question has to be not, can we deploy AI today? It has to be, is there benefit to deploying AI? Do we have a legitimate business case, a legitimate use wherein deployment of new tools can enable or support our mission in a way that we're unable to achieve it today? If the answer to that is no, that you simply want to deploy AI to keep up with the Joneses because it's a cool thing to do, I would encourage you not to. Let's pump the brakes and think about what it is you're really hoping to do. Because as we think about creating value, ISACA defines governance as a value creation process wherein we create desired outcomes at an optimized risk and cost. So 3 variables. What do we really want? What risk are we ready to bear? And then what cost are we prepared to take on to bring this project, this mission to fruition? I think by deploying tools without a clearly defined outcome, necessarily we're strapping ourselves with undue risk and undue burden that just can't be accounted for in so many ways, Kenny.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's interesting as well, and this is going to take us to a bit of a geopolitical conversation here, Patrick.
Yeah,
Obviously, you have the most American of voices, right? There's a real southern twang to your
East
voice,
Tennessee. East
and
Tennessee. Yes.
yeah, so from good old Tennessee, and obviously I'm here in the UK, and the EU is a million miles away from America.
Right.
So in the context of what we're seeing, where actually AI seems to be a real battlefront for geopolitical dominance,
Mhm.
a superpower battle. I mean, in particular, a few threads that I think are useful for the audience to understand are how the US government have, essentially said that they're gonna backstop AI, right? Because AI is essentially a strategically important industry
Yeah.
for global dominance.
Yeah.
How do you see the US and the impact of China and potentially India sort of maybe potentially undermining some of the safety rules? And what can we do about that as a sort of community?
Yeah. So first of all, what can we do about it? So the latter of those two questions, Kenny, until we have realistic and reasonable enforcement and accountability mechanisms in place, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it. Bad actors exist and they always will. Sometimes those bad actors are nation states. That just kind of is what it is. So I do think coalescence around a global framework, global expectations at some point is going to be mandatory. I mean, we've already seen examples where we've been able to do this despite our political differences. War, we know war crimes are war crimes. It's really, really clear when we step over the line in those instances. You know, while that might not be the best direct parallel to what we're dealing with AI regulation, I think it's pretty close. In the U.S., and I'm glad you bring this up because this is really a false dichotomy that's continued to be repeated in the market and in conversations, and that is that somehow regulation, good governance, will stymie innovation. And while superficially that seems like it's a no-brainer. If I've got more regulation, I'm going to move more slowly. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. What governance, what regulation requires, well, what governance requires that supports regulation is that we've taken the time as an organization to stop and think cleanly and maturely about what it is that we intend to do and that we have systems in place to support that decision. I mean, that's really what governance is. Who's accountable? Why are we doing this? Does it make sense? You know, I think to think that that stymies innovation is just counter to reality because with good governance, the analogy that I like best are lines on the football pitch. Back in October, I got to see a World Cup qualifier. I happened to be in Dublin the night that the Republic of Ireland was qualifying for the World Cup. And seeing that team play in person, what you notice is that the players can move very, very quickly at the end lines and the sidelines because they know squarely what's inbounds and they know squarely what's out of bounds. There's no reason to make a hard sprint up the field if the ball's been out of bounds because you know you're wasting your time. No reason to expend effort there. Conversely, when the ball's inbounds, we know that we can go full speed and continue to execute our strategy. Governance offers the same thing to businesses. It provides the inlines, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds, so that we can move quickly, that we can iterate quickly without necessarily wasting time and wasting resources on dead ends. So yeah, I think again, geopolitically, the U.S. has taken the position that we want to limit governance, we want to limit regulation so that we can protect innovation. But I think in doing so, what we're really doing is causing more waste, more risk in the innovation process, rather than bringing clean and solid products to market sooner rather than later. So I think in many ways, the argument falls apart when you think about what it is that you really want to do, which is create desired outcomes at optimized risk and cost.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I play sort of devil's advocate on the side of that. You know, I can really see why there'll be a lot of Americans banging on the table right now. Probably not the business leaders, but those in the AI space going, we don't want to be like Europe, right?
Right. And watching the political process from the outside in, looking at Europe, while I fully support the intent of the EUAI Act, Kenny, I get why people are frustrated. It's almost comical to see the level of indecision and the level of backfighting and the level of, well, we said this is what we wanted, but we're not sure that we want this. I mean, it's really, really hard to follow an indecisive leader. And I think for many businesses situated in the EU today, that's really what you're left with, an environment where you have a very indecisive leader and external regulation and obligation through DSA, through NIS2, through DORA, through the EUAI Act, through GDPR. Suddenly you've got this overwhelming burden of external regulation and a leader that struggles to hold anyone accountable. I get why those businesses think, well, maybe I'll just wait until I have to deal with this to deal with this. But just like thinking that governance stymies innovation, for you business leaders that do carry obligations related to the EUAI Act, waiting is a mistake. You are absolutely painting yourself into a corner by delaying the inevitable, which is creating a responsible development and use program that ensures that you govern AI in a responsible manner.
I think it's interesting because obviously I live in Europe. I'm based in Britain and, you know, selling globally as a business across the US, across Europe. And
Mhm.
it is interesting to see how AI adoption is really accelerated in America. It's taken off hugely. I think in Europe it is increasingly growing, but like you say, that there's more cautiousness in Europe, just simply because
Rightly so.
cultural. It's cultural. I guess one question I do have, and it's something that is mulling around in my head more and more every day now, which is actually around this question of the implications of AI, which is what we've talked about, or we've kind of skirted around somewhat, and setting the right standards, right? I mean, do you have children, Patrick, yourself, or yep,
Three,
3
the 8
children?
and
Yeah.
12.
So do you ever think about some of the implications of AI that isn't governed and what that's going to mean for your children? I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was having a conversation recently with someone around the capabilities that certain staff members and individuals have with AI now versus the general public. And those capabilities are increasing by the day. And so there's this kind of concern that in 10 years' time, we might start to see kind of different tiers of humanity, right? Where some people are so capable with new technology that they're all
Right,
bionic, right? And then others basically still living in this decade.
right.
And that worries me when it comes to being a father. What about you? Like, is there anything that particularly worries you when it comes to sort of AI and the domain that we're in?
So first of all, how many kids do you have, Kenny?
Just the one, just the
Just the
one.
one. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I think my bigger concern doesn't lie in this idea that there will be those that are more fluent than others, because the reality is, Kenny, we already see that. I mean, every generation has a different level, a different willingness to accept and embrace technology, and you look at the difference between the generation that I grew up in and my children, it's insane. I mean, it is absolutely insane the fluency they have with not just existing, but also emerging technologies. It's just part of who they are and how they've grown up. I think my bigger concern is access to information. I really do see potential, less so generationally and more so as we think about things like global north and global south. I see real potential for continued separation in those areas, simply because in the global south, not everyone has access to the tools that they need to build comparable products and services. And so necessarily they become reliant on the global north. But secondary to that, the information that's accessed, Kenny, as you mentioned before, in some cases is just plain wrong. Example here, I've noticed with my children, where I tend to rely on a browser to do research. I'll go to Google, I'll look for what I want to look for. My kids tend to rely on GPT. They'll open up ChatGPT and ask it a question. They don't know, and they don't yet have a level of skepticism to question the results that they're receiving. And so what they do read in response to their prompt is what they take as the gospel truth. And so in many ways, we're creating a scenario where we're miseducating the generations that are coming because we haven't armed them with appropriate skills to question the information that they're getting. In effect, GPT offers the same level of authority that their teachers do, which is a very, very scary thing to me.
Yeah, scares me too, because I think
Right.
anyone interacting with AI every day will realize that it's often wrong.
But very often.
Yeah,
Very often.
very, very often wrong. And how do you tell what's wrong if you don't even know what wrong means in this context, right? You don't have a framing for it. And so that
Right.
is very dangerous. Yeah, very, very dangerous. Or like you say, the skepticism to even challenge it and think, well, that doesn't sound right. So yeah, that's very worrying. And from a safety and sort of legal perspective, then what can we do about that? Because that sounds like a very quite worrying societal second order impact that could be very damaging.
Yeah, and I think so much of it, Kenny, rests in education, not necessarily in more technical education, but more education for the masses about what we should and should not expect as outcomes from these tools. And again, every tool is different. What I use to crunch financial numbers or what I use to evaluate indicators of compromise detected on some network somewhere, those tools are very different than what we see with generative AI, with ChatGPT, with any kind of chat interface. So, I think offering a general level of awareness for the generations to come is absolutely critical. And again, it's a socio-technical system. So for us to focus all of our efforts around building controls around the technology and leaving humans out of the conversation, it's a fundamental mistake. And it's a fundamental mistake that'll lead to some real issues if we aren't careful.
Yeah, it really would, and it really will. And I know I've been using a few film metaphors here, but There is one film that is starting to worry me that it might be prophetic, and I really hope it's not. I don't know if you've ever watched Idiocracy before. It's a comedy, right, about a
I was just
world.
talking about this yesterday. This is so
Really?
great. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. I guess for the audience, Idiocracy is a comedy about a world where essentially for generations and generations, humans have relied on machines to tell them what to do. And essentially after you project that forward, multiple generations, essentially humans lose the ability for critical thinking and the society starts to degrade. So,
Yes.
20 generations from now, we've relied on AI so much that every generation that follows basically doesn't know how to think properly. And before you know it, we're a declining species, right? And that worries me a great deal because you can see the early signs, right?
Well, we're there for what it's worth. Research has been released recently that shows that Gen Z is the first generation wherein all metrics associated with cognitive capabilities have declined.
Wow.
So we're taking a step backward. We are taking a step backward, and there's no way around it. You know, what's interesting about Idiocracy, and those that aren't familiar with the movie that have seen Wall-E, very, very similar. We as humans, our brains want us to be comfortable. Our brains want us to avoid risk. And so we look for comfort and control where we can get it. The more we rely on those tools and give up discomfort, risk, we give up growth, and we give up our humanity. Effectively, we give up the agency that we fought so hard for so many thousands of years to maintain. We're slowly giving it up in the name of ease, in the name of being able to create a puppy picture by typing in a few words to ChatGPT.
So just to take us to our last question, really, which is one we always like to end on, which is for you in the context of the domain you work in and how you see the space, Patrick, what do you think the biggest AI opportunities are right now? Very broad question, but always an educational one.
Yeah, very broad question. I think the biggest opportunity in AI today, and this is very, very biased based on kind of where I sit and what I see, the conversations I have. But I think the biggest opportunity is for us as a global community to clarify expectations. The OECD has done a really, really good job about laying out guidance for responsible AI use. In some way, shape, or form, I think we have to decide that as humans, we're willing to go this far and no more, and then actually build systems and structures that enable validation, testing, and real accountability to ensure that when we do violate those expectations, we're held accountable to address, correct, and fix the issues that we're causing. Because, Kenny, you know this. Effectively, we're talking about automating decisions at scale. And with the introduction of agents that do have some sense of autonomy, in some ways, we're arming this technology to make decisions that can be affected, that can be implemented at scale with very, very little control and very, very little oversight. So it's a very, very scary time. Effectively, we've got a 19-year-old that we've given a credit card to, and we're expecting that 19-year-old to do the right thing with a credit card. The reality is when we check that credit card statement at the end of the month, we're very likely going to be shocked.
Yes.
And I think that's really where we are.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I certainly agree with your point, and I think you're being generous saying 19-year-old,
Yeah,
but I do take the point. I think it's a very good one. Just to kind of take that forward, it's really interesting. I feel almost like the key lesson from what you've just said is that we're all so excited at the moment, right? You talked about optimism and being able to kind of go from optimism to caution. We're also excited at the moment that there isn't really a great deal of control about or thought about the control of AI. And that seems to be, I think, the underlying point here, which is like be responsible, right? If you're gonna,
responsible.
yeah, yeah,
That's it. I mean, that really, really is kind of the mission here is to be responsible. And, for the business leaders on the call, very likely the technical people inside your organization are having these conversations. But what we see is as they boil this up to you, as they relay it up to you, because they don't necessarily speak your language, the language of business, there's a disconnect. And so I would encourage you to revisit those conversations with your technical staff and do what you can to really understand what they're saying. If they can't articulate it well, keep picking. But very likely there's a risk present in your environment that you're not aware of, not because you haven't been told, but because you just don't understand.
Brilliant. What a way to end. That's a great bit
Yes.
of wisdom. Thank you so much, Patrick. I hope you've had fun.
Kenny, so much fun. I really, really appreciate this and I hope we can do it again, quite frankly.